Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. Ethan Randolph never expected a war over his own land, but when a power-hungry HOA declared his farm community property, he knew it was time to fight back. From electrified fences to rampaging chickens, Ethan would stop at nothing to protect what was his. And when the battle hit the courtroom, the HOA never saw it coming. Ethan Randolph had never been one for the city life. After spending years as an Air Force engineer, he found solace in the open fields and quiet mornings of his family's farm, a vast 50-acre stretch of land just beyond the encroaching suburban developments. The farm had been in his family for generations, a legacy of hard work, independence, and a deep respect for nature. He had everything he needed: rows of thriving vegetables, a sturdy red barn, a few dozen free-roaming chickens, a couple of stubborn donkeys, and his prized herd of cattle. It wasn't just land, it was his sanctuary. Life in rural America had once been predictable, peaceful even. He would wake up before sunrise, brew a strong pot of coffee, and step outside onto his wraparound porch to take in the crisp morning air. His chickens clucked lazily as they pecked at the ground, while the distant mooing of his cattle carried across the dewy pastures. The occasional sound of his old tractor chugging along was the only mechanical noise for miles. It was simple, fulfilling, and entirely on his terms. But recently, that peace had been disturbed by the slow but relentless march of suburbia. A few years ago, developers had broken ground on a new gated community just down the road, Maple Creek Estates, a place where identical McMansions lined perfectly paved streets, where residents lived under the watchful eye of a homeowners association that dictated everything from the color of their front doors to the type of mailbox they could use. It was the complete opposite of Ethan's way of life. He never paid much attention to it at first. Live and let live, he figured. As long as they kept to their side of the road, he had no issue. Then things started changing. First, it was the side eyes and disapproving glances from joggers passing by his farm, clearly displeased with the rustic authenticity of his land. Next came the polite but pointed complaints from new neighbors about the barnyard smell and the unsightly nature of his property. That was laughable, considering he had been there decades before their little cookie-cutter paradise had even existed. He ignored it. What did he care about their delicate sensibilities? But then came the letters, printed on expensive letterhead, signed by the HOA's self-proclaimed president, Lorraine Watson. The first one was a suggestion that perhaps he would consider beautifying his farm with a more suburban-friendly aesthetic to enhance community values. He chuckled and tossed it in the fireplace. The second letter was less friendly. It outright demanded that he adhere to community standards, despite the fact that his land had nothing to do with their HOA. Ethan knew trouble was brewing. He had seen this type of overreaching control before, people who got a little taste of power and suddenly thought they ruled the world. He wasn't about to let some suburban dictator tell him how to run his land. No, this was his farm, and he wasn't going to bow to anyone. And so, he took a long sip of his coffee, watching the sun rise over his fields, knowing that soon enough, war was coming. It was a crisp autumn morning when they came. Ethan was in his barn stacking bales of hay when he heard the unmistakable sound of high heels clicking against his gravel driveway. That alone told him this wasn't a social visit. He wiped the sweat from his brow and turned to see three well-dressed individuals standing stiffly at the entrance of his property. At the center of the trio stood Lorraine Watson, the self-proclaimed queen of Maple Creek Estates and president of its ever-so-powerful HOA. She was exactly what he expected: mid-50s, an impeccably tailored beige suit, a pearl necklace that looked like it had never seen a day of real labor, and an expression of barely concealed disgust as she took in the sight of his farm. Beside her, a tall, thin man with slicked-back hair held a clipboard like it was a holy artifact, while the third member, a short woman in oversized sunglasses, clutched a tablet and periodically tapped the screen as if she were documenting every offense his property committed against their sensibilities. Ethan leaned against a wooden post, arms crossed, and raised an eyebrow. "Something I can help you with?" Lorraine pursed her lips before plastering on a well-practiced, insincere smile. "Mr. Randolph, good morning. I'm here as a representative of the Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Ethan gave a slow nod, feigning ignorance. Maple Creek Estates, huh? Ain't that the fancy neighborhood down the road? Can't say I recall signing up for any HOA, though. The woman to her right let out a huff, clearly irritated. We're here to discuss the aesthetic and regulatory concerns your property presents to the community. Aesthetic and regulatory concerns? Ethan repeated, pushing off the post and taking a step toward them. You mean my farm? Lorraine folded her hands neatly in front of her. Let's be civil about this, Mr. Randolph. We're all part of the same community, after all. He let out a short chuckle. That's so. Funny, I don't recall you coming over for a barbecue or asking to borrow a cup of sugar. Her jaw clenched for a fraction of a second before she continued. We're offering you an opportunity to integrate your property into the harmonized aesthetic of Maple Creek Estates. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Harmonized? You mean sterilized? She ignored the jab and pressed forward. There have been multiple complaints from our residents regarding the condition of your land, the odor from your livestock, the unrefined fencing, and, well, she gestured toward the scattered tools and machinery by his barn, the general disarray. Ethan glanced over at his well-maintained working farm. Sure, there was a bit of mud here and there, and maybe he hadn't gotten around to repainting the barn in a decade or two, but this was a farm, not a country club. Let me guess, he said, smirking. You folks want me to repaint my barn, replace my fences with something ornamental, and get rid of my animals. Lorraine gave another rehearsed smile. Not necessarily. However, we do require that properties adjacent to Maple Creek Estates maintain a certain level of visual appeal. We strongly encourage modern fencing, landscaped yards, and— Ethan cut her off. And what? The man with the clipboard cleared his throat. And consider relocating your livestock elsewhere. Perhaps keep only a select few, strictly for decorative purposes. Ethan had to bite the inside of his cheek to keep from laughing. Decorative livestock? Were these people serious? So let me get this straight, he said, rubbing his chin as if in deep thought. You want me to redesign my farm, change my fencing, stop raising livestock, and what? Plant some decorative bushes? We prefer evergreens. The woman with the tablet added helpfully. Ethan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Y'all must have hit your heads on something fancy over there in Maple Creek. This is my land, been in my family for generations. I don't answer to your HOA. Lorraine's fake smile wavered. We were hoping you'd be open to cooperation, Mr. Randolph. Oh, I'm all for cooperation, he replied, just not when it involves some self-important group of suburbanites trying to tell me what to do with my land. A flicker of irritation flashed in her eyes. You may not be a member of the HOA, but you are part of the broader community. We expect all property owners to uphold standards that reflect well on the area. And if I say no? Lorraine's smile disappeared completely. She adjusted her pearl necklace and squared her shoulders. Well, Mr. Randolph, I'd hate for this to escalate beyond friendly discussion. We have ways of ensuring compliance. Ethan stared at her for a long moment, feeling the sharp edge of a challenge in her tone. Then, slowly, he smiled. Well now, he said, taking a step closer, ain't that interesting? She frowned. Excuse me? You came all this way to ask nicely, but now you're telling me there's consequences if I don't play along. See, that tells me something important. And what's that? His grin widened. That you ain't got a damn bit of authority over me. Lorraine's face turned a shade redder than his barn, and the woman with the tablet nearly dropped it in shock. The man with the clipboard took an instinctive step back. Well then, she said tightly, I suppose we'll see how this plays out, won't we? Ethan gave her a friendly clap on the shoulder that almost sent her staggering forward. Oh, I'm sure we will, he said with a wink. As the HOA representatives stormed off, their high-end shoes kicking up dust, Ethan stood at the entrance of his farm, arms crossed, watching them go. He had no doubt they'd be back, but next time he'd be ready. It was barely a week after Ethan sent Lorraine and her polished lackeys packing when the next attack came, and this time they weren't just making demands. They were making claims. Ethan had just finished loading a fresh batch of hay onto his trailer when he noticed an official-looking envelope tucked into his mailbox. Unlike the usual junk mail or farming supply catalogs, this one had legal weight to it. His name was printed in bold across the front, and the return address bore the insignia of Maple Creek Estates HOA Legal Department. Leaning against the porch railing, he tore it open, his brow furrowing as he read. Dear Mr. Randolph, we are pleased to inform you that your property has been designated as part of the Maple Creek Community Green Space Initiative. As such, effective immediately, your land is classified as shared community land and is now available for the recreational use of all Maple Creek Estates residents. Please note that access gates will be installed at designated entry points. Residents have the right to traverse and enjoy the land freely. Existing fencing that restricts community access must be removed. Livestock should be relocated to prevent disruptions to recreational activities. We appreciate your cooperation and look forward to your participation in maintaining a shared, welcoming environment for our esteemed neighborhood. Sincerely, Lorraine Watson, HOA President. Ethan blinked once, then twice. Then he let out a slow, incredulous laugh. They can't be serious. But they were. Storming inside, he grabbed his phone and dialed the county clerk's office. Within minutes, he had confirmation. No legal filing had been made to alter the ownership or zoning of his land. But the HOA had submitted a petition to the local council claiming that his property was unutilized community space and lobbying for it to be reclassified as a public recreational area. They weren't just demanding changes now. They were trying to steal his land. By the time he stepped back onto his porch, he saw the first wave of invaders. A group of joggers in sleek athletic gear were trotting straight across his field, completely ignoring his fences. Behind them, a mother with a double-wide stroller was pushing straight through his cabbage patch, chattering away on her phone like she was walking through a city park. Further down, a group of teenagers on bicycles were weaving between his cows, laughing as they threw water bottles at the confused animals. Ethan's blood boiled. Marching toward the fence line, he whistled sharply. His border collie, Duke, perked up from his usual napping spot and took off like a rocket, barking furiously. The joggers screamed as Duke charged, scattering in different directions. One woman tripped and landed in a fresh pile of cow dung, flailing like a tipped-over turtle. "Oh my God! This is a public space. Call security," she shrieked. From the cabbage patch, the stroller mom spun toward Ethan, outraged. "Excuse me," she barked. "You need to control that animal. This is dangerous for children." Ethan crossed his arms, his expression cold. "Lady, that ain't a public park. That's my damn farm. And you just ran over a good month's worth of cabbage." She huffed and adjusted her oversized sunglasses. "This is part of the HOA green space now. We have every right to be here." "Oh, do ya?" Ethan drawled, taking out his phone and snapping a clear picture of her flattened crops and stroller wheels caked in cabbage guts. "I'll be sure to send this to my lawyer and the sheriff." The teenagers, meanwhile, had started taunting his cows. One particularly arrogant kid threw a rock toward one of the larger bulls. A mistake. The bull snorted, pawed the dirt, and began to charge. The kid barely had time to process what was happening before he screamed like a banshee and pedaled furiously, his bike tires kicking up dust as the enraged bull gave chase. By the time the HOA's finest fled for their lives, Ethan was left standing at his fence, shaking his head. He had expected arrogance. He had expected entitlement, but he hadn't expected them to actually declare war. And if war was what they wanted, they were about to get it. The next morning, Ethan was halfway through fixing a section of his fence when he heard it, the unmistakable cacophony of entitled voices carrying across his land. He didn't even have to turn around to know they were back. This time, it wasn't just joggers and rogue bicyclists. It was a full-on suburban invasion. He turned, and his jaw nearly dropped. A line of SUVs and luxury sedans was parked haphazardly along the road, their drivers unloading lawn chairs, picnic baskets, and yoga mats. A woman in designer workout gear was directing a group of seniors as they rolled out a yoga mat formation near his pond. A few steps away, a man in a golf polo was attempting to set up a portable barbecue on his property, and that wasn't the worst of it. A pack of rowdy children had stormed into his chicken coop, squealing in delight as they chased his hens around like they were in a petting zoo. One kid grabbed a particularly feisty hen, Bertha. Bertha, his oldest and meanest hen, had zero patience for nonsense. The moment she felt small, grubby hands wrapping around her, she let out an unholy screech and flapped her wings with the force of a miniature hurricane. The boy shrieked and stumbled backward, arms pinwheeling. But it was too late. Bertha had backup. Within seconds, 3 more hens rushed in, pecking and flapping like tiny feathered warriors. The boy screamed like he was being mauled by a grizzly. "Help! Help!" he wailed, tripping over himself as he bolted from the coop, Bertha and her army in hot pursuit. Ethan leaned against the fence, sipping his coffee, watching the absolute pandemonium unfold. The barbecue guy had knocked over his own grill in his panic, spilling coals onto the grass. The yoga instructor had toppled sideways when Duke, his border collie, decided to herd the chaos away from the coop. And then, as if on cue, one of the donkeys got involved. A kid, emboldened by the madness, had tried to climb onto Jasper, one of Ethan's older donkeys. Jasper, however, was not in the mood. With one solid kick, Jasper sent the kid flying into a pile of hay. That was it. The once confident Maple Creek invaders panicked. Parents scooped up their wailing children. Yoga enthusiasts abandoned their mats. And the joggers, who had returned for round 2, bolted like gazelles. And in the middle of it all, Bertha stood victorious, fluffing her feathers as her defeated foes fled. Lorraine Watson arrived moments later, disheveled and fuming. "This is outrageous," she shrieked, marching up to Ethan, her face redder than his barn. Ethan casually took another sip of his coffee. "What is?" he asked innocently. She flailed an arm toward the chaos. "Your animals attacked us." He tilted his head. "Oh, you mean when your people trespassed onto private property and harassed my livestock?" Lorraine's nostrils flared. "That is community land." Ethan held up his phone, pressing play on a very clear video he had taken of the entire disaster. "Nah," he said, smirking. "Looks like trespassing, harassment of livestock, and destruction of property to me. Maybe I should call the sheriff and get an official opinion." Lorraine opened her mouth, then snapped it shut. She knew she was cornered. Instead, she let out a huff, turned on her heel, and stormed away, yelling at the stragglers to gather their belongings. As the last of the Maple Creek invaders retreated, Ethan tipped his hat and turned back to his fence. The first battle had been fought, and the war had only just begun. Ethan wasn't the kind of man to let a fight drag on without taking action. The HOA had declared war on his land, and now it was time to set some traps. He spent the next 2 days preparing, starting with the electric fence. Not the kind that could seriously harm anyone, just a mild livestock-grade zap strong enough to deter both wild animals and entitled suburbanites. He installed clear warning signs every few feet. Private property, high-voltage fence, trespassers will be shocked. Would the HOA take them seriously? He hoped not. Next, he turned his attention to the mud pit. Thanks to a week of rain, one section of his property had already turned into a natural swampy mess. With a little strategic digging, he expanded it just enough to turn it into a perfectly camouflaged sinkhole of humiliation. To finish it off, he loosened the top layer of grass and laid it carefully over the mud. Now, anyone who tried taking a shortcut across that section of land would be in for a very rude surprise. With everything set, Ethan leaned against his porch railing, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Tomorrow, the HOA would make their next move, and tomorrow they'd regret it. It didn't take long. By mid-morning, a new wave of Maple Creek residents, led of course by Lorraine Watson herself, showed up in force. 2 men in polo shirts marched toward his fence with wire cutters, clearly intending to remove what they considered an unauthorized obstruction. Ethan barely had time to sit back with his coffee before the first idiot grabbed the wire. Bzzzt! The man let out a yelp, stumbling back as a harmless but jolting shock zapped through him. He cursed loudly, shaking out his hands. His friend, apparently believing himself smarter, tried using the wire cutters. But the moment the metal made contact, another satisfying jolt sent him jumping backward like a spooked cat. Ethan laughed. "Oh, I told you it was hot." Lorraine shrieked in frustration. "This is illegal. You can't electrify a community fence." Ethan took his sweet time standing up, tipping his hat. "Ain't a community fence, Lorraine. It's a farm fence, perfectly legal to keep livestock in, and people like you out." As she fumed, a new set of screams erupted from behind her. Ethan turned just in time to see 2 women and a teenage boy go stumbling forward into the shortcut area he had so carefully prepared. 1 step, 2 steps, then splat! They vanished into the mud pit, sinking up to their waists. The teenager flailed wildly, sending thick clumps of mud flying in all directions. One of the women lost a shoe, her fancy handbag floating beside her like a lost canoe. "Who are you? AW, oh my God!" she shrieked, her sunglasses now completely askew. Ethan leaned against the fence, watching with a slow, satisfied grin. "Y'all enjoying the community land?" Lorraine's face burned red with rage. "This isn't over," she bellowed. Ethan shrugged. "Oh, I sure hope not." Because this was just the beginning. By the time court day arrived, the tension in the air was so thick it could be cut with a knife. The small-town courtroom was packed to the brim. Maple Creek Estates residents filled one side, most of them wearing smug expressions, convinced of their victory. Lorraine Watson, dressed in an expensive beige suit with a pearl necklace so tight it looked like it might choke her, sat at the front of the room, her back stiff, her lips pressed into a thin line. Ethan, however, walked in like he was strolling onto his own front porch. He was calm, collected, and completely unfazed. He had seen far worse than a bunch of suburbanites trying to steal his land. The judge, an old, no-nonsense man who had clearly seen enough petty property disputes to last a lifetime, adjusted his glasses and sighed. "Mrs. Watson, you may proceed." Lorraine stood dramatically, clutching her stack of documents as if they were sacred texts. She turned to face the judge with the kind of exaggerated distress only an HOA president could muster. "Your Honor," she began, her voice dripping with false politeness, "we are here today because Mr. Randolph has repeatedly obstructed community efforts to develop and enhance our neighborhood. He has—" Lisa Carter, Ethan's lawyer, cut in smoothly. "Objection, Your Honor. We challenge the claim that my client's land is community property." The judge let out an exhausted sigh. "Sustained. Mrs. Watson, let's keep it factual." Lorraine stiffened but nodded, her jaw clenching. "Fine," she said, attempting to regain control. "The real issue here is that Mr. Randolph has made it impossible for our residents to enjoy the land that should rightfully be shared." Lisa arched an eyebrow. "Shared?" Lorraine nodded enthusiastically, sensing an opening. "Yes. For years, this land has been an essential space for Maple Creek families, where children could play, where nature walks could be enjoyed, where the community could come together. Mr. Randolph has robbed us of that." Ethan leaned back in his chair, amused. Lisa, however, was waiting for this. "Your Honor, I'd like to present Exhibit A." She walked to the judge's bench, setting down a thick folder. "This is a certified copy of Mr. Randolph's property deed, proving that his family has owned this land for over a century. Furthermore, we have official records from the county clerk confirming that no legal filing was ever made to reclassify this land as community property." The judge flipped through the paperwork. His frown deepened. Lorraine's eye twitched. Well, legal definitions aside, the fact remains that— Lisa cut her off again. "And, if I may, Your Honor." She walked to a projector set up in the courtroom. The screen behind her lit up with images. HOA residents trespassing, kids stomping through crops, people hosting barbecues on private land, Lorraine herself, mid-fall, sinking into the mud pit. A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Even some of the HOA board members looked uncomfortable. Lorraine's face burned bright red. Lisa turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, not only has the HOA trespassed, but they have actively encouraged destruction of private property, ignored legal boundaries, and—" She paused for effect before pulling out one last piece of damning evidence. A recording. Lisa pressed play. Through the speakers, Lorraine's own voice echoed through the courtroom. "We'll just keep pushing. He'll give up. He has no choice. We'll make it impossible for him to say no." Lorraine snapped her head up in horror. "That is taken out of context," she screeched. The judge held up a hand, silencing her. His face was stone cold. "Mrs. Watson, do you deny that this is your voice?" Lorraine froze. Her mouth opened, closed, then opened again. She was cornered. She faltered, then snapped toward her own lawyer. "You told me this wouldn't come up. You said we had the paperwork to make it legitimate." The lawyer, who had clearly just realized he was representing a sinking ship, immediately distanced himself. We're not aware of this particular recording, Your Honor." Lorraine looked around desperately, her eyes darting toward the Maple Creek residents for support. But instead of backing her up, many of them were whispering among themselves, throwing her accusatory glances. One man in the crowd, one of the HOA's biggest supporters, stood up. Wait a damn second, did she lie about the land being community property? Another woman gasped, I paid extra fees because they told us we'd have access to a private park. The courtroom exploded into noise. Lorraine, seeing her empire crumbling before her eyes, tried one last desperate attempt. She stood up so fast her chair screeched against the floor. Your Honor, if we could just… The judge banged his gavel. Enough. Silence fell. The judge adjusted his glasses and sighed. I've seen enough. Ithon was awarded damages for destruction of property. The HOA was forced to issue a public retraction about his land being community space. Lorraine was personally fined for attempting to forge property claims. The HOA's legal petition was dismissed with prejudice, meaning they could never bring this nonsense to court again. Lorraine sat frozen, her face drained of color. Maple Creek residents, once loyal to her, turned their backs. The moment court adjourned, Lorraine stormed out, shoving past people, her face twisted in rage. This isn't fair. This isn't over, she spat. Ithon, grinning ear to ear, tipped his hat. Oh, sweetheart, it's over. And as she stormed out into the parking lot, humiliated and alone, he let out a long, satisfied breath. He had won. His land was his. And, best of all, the HOA dead and buried. The aftermath of the trial was nothing short of a complete implosion of Maple Creek Estates HOA. Lorraine Watson, once the self-appointed queen of suburban perfection, had been publicly humiliated, fined, and exposed as a fraud. Her reign of terror had officially ended, but the fallout? That was the real cherry on top. Within days of the ruling, news of the case spread like wildfire through town. Local reporters ate up the scandal, plastering headlines like, Farmer destroys HOA's land grab attempt and wins big. The chickens fought back. Small-town farmer teaches HO a lesson. The residents of Maple Creek Estates, they weren't happy. Lorraine had promised them exclusive access to what she had claimed was soon-to-be community land. Some of them had even paid extra fees for upcoming enhancements to the neighborhood park that never actually existed. Now, they were demanding refunds. The HOA board members, scrambling to save face, turned on each other almost immediately. Lorraine, once surrounded by loyal yes-men, found herself completely abandoned. One by one, board members resigned, hoping to escape the fallout, until the HOA itself collapsed under the weight of lawsuits and internal chaos. Within a month, Lorraine had put her house on the market and left town. No goodbye letters, no farewell parties, just a for sale sign and a moving truck in the dead of night. And Ithon, he enjoyed every damn second of it. With Lorraine gone, the former residents of Maple Creek started seeing the HOA for what it really was, a scam. They weren't just mad at her. They were mad at themselves for letting her control them for so long. Several homeowners came to Ithon's farm apologizing for their behavior. I don't know why we went along with it, one woman admitted. We thought the HOA was protecting our property values, but all it did was make us miserable. I paid $3,000 in fines for having the wrong mailbox color, another man grumbled. $3,000 for a mailbox. Ithon, never one to hold grudges against those who weren't beyond redemption, simply nodded. Y'all were just following the wrong leader, he said. Now maybe you can start fresh. And they did. Within a few months, Maple Creek residents voted to disband the HOA permanently. No more ridiculous restrictions. No more fines for Christmas decorations that were too colorful. No more tyrants in beige pantsuits deciding what kind of flowers they could plant. For the first time, they actually started acting like neighbors. Some even offered to help fix the damage done to Ithon's property. And while he wasn't about to let them off that easy, he did let a select few prove they weren't all bad. In return, he invited them to his annual 4th of July barbecue. By the time summer rolled around, Ithon had restored his farm to its full glory. His fences were stronger than ever, his fields were flourishing, and most importantly, his land was his again. So when the 4th of July arrived, he threw a party like never before. Neighbors from all over, even some of the former Maple Creek residents, showed up. He grilled up ribs, steaks, and his famous spicy sausages, the kind that could make a grown man sweat bullets. Kids ran around playing, this time without trespassing on his land. At some point, someone turned on the news, and they all got one final surprise. A short news segment covering a lawsuit filed against Lorraine Watson by several ex-Maple Creek residents flashed across the screen. Turns out, after fleeing town, she tried starting a new HOA in another county. It didn't go well. One of the reporters summed it up perfectly. Former HOA President Lorraine Watson, known for controversial property disputes, is facing multiple lawsuits after attempting to enforce illegal regulations in a new development. Residents claim she attempted to dictate landscaping, pet ownership, and even how often they could park in their own driveways. The camera zoomed in on her, looking just as furious and embarrassed as the day she lost to Ethan in court. The whole party erupted into laughter. Ethan, leaning back in his chair with a cold beer in hand, just smirked. Well, ain't that just poetic? And with that, he tipped his hat back and let the summer breeze roll over him, knowing that his farm, his home, was finally safe. The HOA was dead. His land was his. And life was damn good.